Hello. Just to start off, I begin today by acknowledging the Gunditj Mara people, traditional custodians of the land on which Warrnambool stands, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So, welcome to the F Project Poetry Swaps event. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for the team at the F Project for organising this event today. My name is Leanne Moden, as I said before, and I'm the current virtual writer in residence at the F Project. I just want to, before we get started, also thank Melbourne City of Literature for organising the Writers' Residency. As I said before, I'm based in Nottingham in the UK, and I thought it'd be really lovely to bring together two poets from Nottingham and two poets from Warrnambool to share their poetry and to have a little chat about the process of creating poetry. So how this event is going to work this evening / this morning. What we will do is we will be hearing from each of the poets in turn. They'll be doing a couple of poems each for us, just to get us warmed up and get us kicked off into poetry, which will be really, really lovely. Then we'll be having a bit of a chat together, and I've got some pre-prepared questions, so I'm going to grill the poets and hopefully get some conversation going. And then at the end, we will be able to answer some questions from you in the audience if you have any. So again, for the first part of this event, it would be really good if you could keep your Zoom muted while we listen to the performers. If at any point you'd like to show your appreciation for the work, you can wave your hands like this for visual applause, which is really, really lovely because everybody gets to see how much you've loved their work. And you can also share some encouraging words in the chat box below, which is at the bottom of your screen. You're also more than welcome to put any questions that you'd like to ask any of the poets into that chat box too, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. And hopefully we'll get time to hear your questions or put your questions to the audience at the end there. So that's enough from me, I think, enough ridiculous chat. Let's get on with the poetry. So I'm going to introduce you first to Sue Allen. Sue is a poet based in Nottinghamshire in the UK, and she's been performing her work across the East Midlands for around 20 years. She's known for her sharp observation and wit, and her earlier work was funny and feminist in focus. Over recent years, she has examined more serious themes around grief and recovery, and her latest pamphlet, Finding Comfort in Salt, was published in 2020 by Big White Shed in Nottingham. It's currently available directly from Sue. So if you would like a copy and you don't yet have one, please do pop that in the chat as well. Sue has featured at numerous poetry festivals and is an active member of the DIY Poets and the Paper Cranes Poetry Collective. So Sue, we would love to hear from you. Big round of applause, please, for Sue.
Hello, good morning, good evening, depending which side of the world you're on. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to do two pieces. They're not connected in any way. The first one is from my most recent pamphlet, and the second one is an older piece of work. So this is called Talking to Elephants. It's about all the things we don't say when we're feeling pretty angry. I killed an elephant today. I took my flip knife, drew it across his throat, and watched as all the unspoken words poured out, spilling letterheads in paragraphs across the floor. Chris said I should probably talk to the elephants, make it a two-way exchange. Maybe they had something important to tell me. Snick-snack went the blade forward and back, forming flesh wounds, paper cuts of accusations, spelling out, if ignorance is bliss, I'll come back to that. Leanne said I should write them letters of engagement. Don't look for forgiveness, don't seek explanations, don't expect answers. Plunging in nib deep, I wrote on his heart, why, if, only. The ink of his blood stained my fingers, formed into blots of regret at my feet. Laura said, dance with the elephants, show them that you know the steps. Lifting my hobnail stiletto boot, I swung into his flesh, kicked into the grey smoke of his illusion, and did not stop until all the leather was tanned. Owl said, none of this was real, and I had nothing to fear from ancient elephants. I would burn them, light their tails like giant Molotov cocktails, throw them through windows, turn them into tallow candles, melting into greasy grey pools, slicking into corners. John said the elephants were merely instruments, willing me to rock and roll around their heads. He says I should play them like the punk I am. Smashing yellow guitars into schools, I see them shatter, scatter, smack into smithereens of accusation like a crescendo of silence. Claire said I should paint the elephants, define their lines, show them I know the shape of them, brushes and all. Digging pigment into their elephant eyes, I blind myself to their existence, turning them into installations of anger in all the unseen colours. Ella said I should give them names, make them pets. I had no coherent answer for that one. Thank you. This second one is a feminist anthem, really, and I wrote it quite a few years ago, but it remains popular. It's called Upsetting the Apple Cart. You can drive me from the garden, citing lust and shame, but still I'll come scrumping for apples. You can drown me in the duck pond, you can hang me as a witch, confine me in skulls' bridles, leave me murdered in a ditch, but still I'll come scrumping for apples. You can blame me for your issues, try to bend me in God's name, exclude me from your politics and play all your schoolboy games. But still, I'll come scrumping for apples. You can beat me, you can rape me, you can tell me I'm not free, but watch your effing back, mate, 'cause I'm coming for your tree. I'm breaking down your branches with a flicking of my thumb, and when the dust has settled and you're running for your mum, I'll climb upon your ruins and shout, the scrumping's never done. How'd you like them apples? Thank you.
Ah, amazing. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
I love both of those poems, so thank you so much for sharing those. And if you like those poems, please do say what you liked about them in the chat, because it's really nice as poets when we hear or when we read what people have liked about our poems. Thank you, Sue, for that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on to our next poet. So Ray Liversidge is an Australian poet whose latest book is Orador Glani. I've butchered that. Sorry, you'll have to say it properly for me in a moment.
Orador Saglan.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ray. And that was
My French is brilliant.
published in 2017 by Little Fox Press. A French and English version of the book was published in 2019. His other books are No Suspicious Circumstances, Portraits of Poets, brackets dead, The Barrier Range, The Divorce Papers, and Obeying the Call. He also appeared with two other poets in the first issue of Triptych Poets. His verse novel, The Barrier Range, was adapted for stage and performed as Seeking Fabled Waters at the 2010 Melbourne Writers' Festival. In that year, he also won the Bruce Dorr National Poetry Prize and was commended in the Rosemary Dobson Prize. His poetry has appeared in over 80 journals and anthologies in Australia, the US, Canada, the UK, Scotland, Ireland, and Spain. And he has his own website, which I will pop in the chat while he is reading. So please, can we give a big round of applause, please, for Ray?
Thanks, Leanne. I'll just read a couple of poems, family poems, basically. I don't think I'll have time for a third. See how we go. But two is probably enough. So look, the first one I'll read, and my daughter is online for, so it's for her. It's for my oldest daughter, Sarah. So hopefully she's not embarrassed. And it describes an experience when we snorkeled on the Great Barrier Reef, which is off the state of Queensland, off the east coast of Australia. And this is when she was 10 years old, so this is quite a while ago. And it's called Reef Dreaming, and it's obviously for Sarah. Leaving the boat, you enter the world of water, naked of knowledge, schooled only in the use of snorkel, mask, and flipper. At first, uncertain of the ocean's depth, your arms and legs go everywhere, the sudden terror in your heart heard in each troubled breath. A fish swims in front of you, then another, and another. The colours brighter than the brightest colours in your favourite box of paints. Now your mouth becomes a gill, limbs, a tail, and fin. You drift among reef and fish, a friend, a fellow fish, until the reef appears like the living thing it is, to crawl out from the shadows and seek the light it feeds upon. Now, caught between coral and the source of light, fish dreaming turns to fear. You feel the reef slice into your flesh like a knife, gills filling with water. Taking your hand, we find a sandbank to stand upon, and I explain how the glass in the mask magnifies the view. It changes the look of things, I say, like the mind does when it dreams. Still holding hands, we turn our backs on the reef and push off for the shore, floating like lovers on a canvas by Chagall. And yeah, I'll finish with, it's a poem for my mother. So I wrote a poem about my father, which happened to win a prize, and I told her about it, and she wasn't too impressed, given that I hadn't written one about her. So she sort of suggested, stroke demanded, that I write a poem for her. So I did, and this ended up winning a prize as well. So we broke bread. It's simply called The Bowl. Domestic, the memories of mothers. Forget the faded photo of a girl on horseback, the wedding shots. I wasn't there, and I have moved beyond the want of rivalry. While Dad was always in the shed or out the back somewhere, you could be found in the kitchen. We knew what day it was by what we ate. Yet now I understand why on some days you refused to cook, cried, threw cutlery, and called us a pack of bastards if we answered or didn't answer back. Your hysteria took root in the word. When I visit now, it's to find you on a cold and sunless afternoon, stooped over the stove, ladling soup. The warmth from the hot plate holding you for a moment before you turn to show your face. I take the bowl you offered, the plate of buttered bread. And that'll do from me. Thank you.
Beautiful stuff. Thank you so much, Ray. Those were really gorgeous.
You.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm really enjoying this so far. What a lovely variety of poetry that we've already had, and we're only halfway through. How exciting! So I'm going to move on then from Ray to our next poet. Our next poet is Manjit Sahota. Manjit is the co-founder of Poets Against Racism and a local Nottingham poet. He's performed in a number of venues in Nottingham and around the UK since 2016. He's delivered workshops for a number of schools and local organisations in Nottingham, sharing his spoken word poetry to encourage others to write, read and perform poetry. He formed Poets Against Racism in 2016 to rally poets, spoken word artists and rappers to use their poetry to challenge the rise in racism in the UK and to spread the word of unity, humanity and love. Most recently, Manjit became the Slam Champion of the Derby Poetry Festival in 2021. So can I have a huge round of applause, please, for Manjit?
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Friday. This is what Fridays will look like from now on. Great, we'll all stick together. It's beautiful to be here, really happy. So I'm going to read two poems. And the first one is dedicated to the activists who are fighting for climate change, against climate change. And the COP26 conference took place in Glasgow, and world leaders did nothing. And it's a bit like asking world leaders to give up fossil fuels, like asking vampires to give up blood. So I think we need to do it ourselves to save the planet. So this poem's dedicated to all the activists. It's called If My Words Were Drops of Blood. If my words were drops of blood, then this is not a poem. I'm bleeding, but I'll not lose consciousness before I stop. You see, the pain is real. I can't watch the world go by on TV. If Ant and Dec are there to entertain, I'd rather be detained. They say poetry is the mind language for light bulb moments, moments when we watched your napalm orange flame lick our enemies in the jungle, while water cannon fingers pushed me around, followed by the sound of leather-wrapped willow on skull, against black, white, men, women, organised or marginalised. To them, it matters none. And you still tear gas our children, for crying out loud. You see, when the news is brought to you by the right, you're surprised they leave out the left. So we will not be fooled by the press, but strike when the iron's hot. We live in a world where the centre is extreme and the fringes can be cool. Cool to stand for something, cool to fight for something, cool to march for something. So we will not stand down, hold our tongue, know our place and listen to your civil lies. We march with pictures of our dead, so they do not bury the living. Armed with love, a shield of solidarity, nerves of steel and a heart of gold, we march on. Because we will not disappear, moderate, evaporate, simulate, dissipate, but congregate, agitate, irritate and regenerate. We will bring our history and bite the head off your future. We will disarm the rulers, turn out the lights and leave them in the dark. We will take back our ball and no longer play for the elite. We will learn to swim against the tide, for we're the guardians that keep communities alive. We will no longer cradle billionaire babies with hands of coal, steel, sugar and gold. We will not fall asleep listening to your narcotic national anthem. We will not let the grass grow under our feet while you burn the sky. We will not go quietly and accept the right to remain silent. We will no longer bury our children, but bite the hand that feeds hate. We will be annoying, a nuisance, disrespectful if we are disbelieved. We are not one snowflake, we are a storm. And we are not tired of fighting, but tired of being led by spineless knights at the helm. And we will not shout alone, but roar with the many. So if my words are drops of blood, then I'm still bleeding, and only vampires would watch and do nothing. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's refugees at the border of Europe. Refugees are freezing and dying. Children are dying from Syria, from around the world, on the border of Poland. And there are Polish flags stopping them getting into Europe. And those flags, they think, is to protect their country. And that sort of nationalism and that sort of flag worshipping is really dangerous. So we need to be wary of how people use flags to divide us. So this poem is dedicated to all the refugees, and I hope they get in. This poem's called My Flag. My flag has no edge or borders. It doesn't make me stand up salute. It doesn't give me orders. My flag is the colour of a bloodstain, some lost in battle, some still in vain. My flag is not a football slogan or a reason to learn to hate. My flag is the difference in humanity, something to celebrate. My flag is for my children and for your children too. My flag is for the many, not for the privileged few. My flag is not owned by kings or queens or by the nation state. My flag says break these mental chains. My flag says liberate. My flag has no spread eagle, yellow star or rising sun. My flag is an open heart. There's room for everyone. My flag is not on the side of a bank or on a dollar bill. My flag has never declared war. My flag doesn't know how to kill. My flag is not made of gold or diamonds, nor does it smell of oil. My flag waves in the streets below, in the hands of struggle and toil. My flag is not the history of rulers past. It's the history we've yet to write. My flag is not here to add to the darkness. My flag is here to bring you the light. My flag is my mother's tongue, although I'm not here to see. My flag is not here to keep you out. My flag is here to set you free. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Manjit. That was wonderful. Really, really enjoyed that. Oh, wonderful. And if you enjoyed it, please do let Manjit know in the chat as well. We have got one more poet left. And I might do a couple of poems as well after this. I'll see how I feel. But next up is Brendan Ryan. So Brendan grew up on a dairy farm in Panmure in Western Victoria. I hope I've said that right, Brendan. Yep. His poetry reviews and essays have been published in literary journals and newspapers, including Magean, Ireland, Southerly, Westerly, Antipodes, The Age, The Weekend Australian, The Best Australian Poems series, and Contemporary Australian Poetry. His poem Blister Country was included in A Single Tree by Don Watson. Critical essays on his poetry have appeared in The Age and the Australian Poet's Voice column by Sarah Holland Batt. The author of 6 collections of poetry, Travelling Through the Family was shortlisted for the 2014 Victoria Premiers Award. His latest collection of poetry, The Lowlands of Moden, was published with Wallier Press in 2019. His memoir, Walk Like a Cow, was published in December 2020. And I'm certain that I've mispronounced almost all of the names in that bio, so I'm sorry about that, Brendan. But here is Brendan Ryan. Big round of applause, please, for Brendan.
Thank you, Leanne. And no, you did a pretty good job in pronunciation. That was fantastic. Thank you. And good evening and good morning to everyone. It's great to see your faces, whether you're here in Australia or over there in England or the UK, or Europe, I should say. Now I'm going to read a poem from, this is a cover, if you can see it, The Lowlands of Moden. So Moden is a small kind of area in Victoria, and it's taken from its Irish background. Of course, in Ireland, there's several Moyns, and this is an area that my father grew up in Victoria. I'm going to read 2 poems about cows, and Manjit will find a connection to one of the poems, the second poem. But I'll read the first one. It's called Heifer Wearing a Fence Post. And if you've not come from a dairy farm, you may be unfamiliar with this practice that probably doesn't get used now. So when cows used to get through fences and get into other paddocks and the neighbours, sometimes the farmers would tie a fence post around their neck so that they wouldn't do it so much. And this is a poem about that kind of practice, I guess. After wearing a fence post. When she lowers her muzzle to the clover, the post chafes her neck, swings against her shoulder. No more than a wooden spacer tied to a loop of cyclone wire strung round her neck. She wears her post like a cross, bears its weight, its annoying shape, for the days needed to corral a wayward heifer. Aversion therapy, designed to stop her twisting through fences, the lone heifer who discards the herd to freely wander. The same process we use to justify drowning kittens in a Hessian bag, whacking crippled calves on the head with an axe, watching the cattle buyer jab an electric prodder into cows reluctant to climb into the darkness of a cattle truck. In moments such as these, we separate ourselves from the animals, realize who we are, to detach ourselves from the fear of the cow we are selling. Like chaining a dog or dehorning a bull, our aim is to contain something wild, rebellious, a heifer who will twist her neck to pull at ryegrass on the neighbour's boundary, her fence post bowing the barbed wire before she pulls back, snickets of orange fur snagging. She learns to wear her post as a sailor wears an albatross. Other heifers keep their distance, shun her affliction. Each time she shakes her head at flies, the post knocks against her side like a voice reminding her to pause before fences. Thank you. And so I grew up on a dairy farm, and I went to India a few times traveling and so on. And so coming from a dairy farm when cows are in paddocks and fences, I got kind of the fright of my life when all the cows were wandering around the streets. And at first I thought, where's the paddocks, where's the fences? So this is called Cows in India. The first time I saw cows in India, I wanted to round them up, yard them, milk them, close the gate on a paddock, watch them nod along a cattle track. Instead, they wandered down alleys, up steps, along gats, singular as sadhus. They ate what was given, scraps, leftovers, plastic, cardboard, even slurping their tongues into huge woks of curries as they shambled onward, forever onward. Although I have seen a Brahmin meditate in the middle of cyclists, rickshaws, buses and beggars, unlike Holstein Friesians, the Indian cow is neither jumpy or ear-tagged. They possess a quiet that is mundane as flicking a fly with an ear. I've seen them dead at roundabouts, have had to back away from the trembling eye of a water buffalo. I travelled to India not looking for answers, just fences, gates that farm the cows in India lacked. Locals even painted their horns blue, hung flowers round their necks. The first time I saw cows in India, I wanted to round them up. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful stuff. Thank you so much, Brendan. That was really, really brilliant. Ah, lovely. Oh, I'm so impressed by the variety and the beauty of the poetry that we've had so far this evening. It's so nice for me as a poet and as a host as well to get to experience writing from across the world and from our own backyard as well. So thank you all for sharing your work. I'm going to share a couple of poems, if I may, just to round off this part of the session. And once I've done a couple of poems, we will move on to our chat. Just going to pin myself. There we go. Gosh, that's a big face. Okay. So I'm going to read you a couple from my latest collection, which is called Get Over Yourself, and came out with Burning Eye Books in 2020, which was, I think you'll agree, those of you who've had collections out in 2020, a terrible year to produce a book, but we weren't to know that at the time. This first poem is called Fish Face, and it's about self-esteem, body image, and mermaids. Of course, we knew they existed. in picture books and fairy tales. But when we finally dredged one up from the depths, we were more than a little surprised. She was nothing like we imagined. No long flowing hair and sun-kissed skin, no silvery voice and wide submissive eyes, no pert little breath, modestly shielded from sight behind a seashell bra. No, she was nothing like we imagined. All iridescent scales crusted with barnacles, wild seaweed frond hair and a voice like a hurricane, gills and teeth and spines more monster than maiden. She was fascinating, but she would never make the cover of a magazine. Still, we lapped up every TV interview, documentary and podcast, every forward-thinking think piece and long-form feminist essay. And when one Saturday morning TV presenter broached the question of her appearance, we held our breath. She said, "My body carries me across oceans and through storms. My body can withstand the pressure of 5,000 fathoms of seawater and swim for 6 miles without rest. My body has borne me children and survived the sharks and sea monsters of this world. My body is my instrument. My body is my weapon. My body is exactly what I need it to be. It may not be perfect, but I am not afraid of it because my body is beautiful." Soon, models were walking the runways wearing artificial gills, and young people were saving to have scales surgically implanted under their skin. Green hair dye sold out in the shops, and swimming pool salesmen struggled to meet the demand. People prayed for gills and teeth and spines. The mermaid, realizing that humanity had almost entirely missed the point, returned to the sea. Thank you. And I'm just going to do you one more, and this one is called A Piece of the Pie. Look, everyone gets a piece of the pie, but some get more than others. It's only fair. They were here first. Or if they weren't here first, then they paid more. Or if they didn't pay more, then they certainly looked like they could afford more, which is why they got more at no extra cost. I wouldn't expect you to understand. It's complicated. Some people have asked for more but didn't get it, while some people could do with less but won't be persuaded to share. Some people have been coming here for years and think we owe them something. Some people can't read the menu, so those people get crumbs. Some people don't realize that some people have already eaten. Some people have already eaten but still feel the gnawing hunger. Some people haven't eaten for days. Everyone gets a piece of the pie, but some people are never satisfied. Some people have been stealing food. Someone is always stealing something. Some slices look bigger than others because some slices are bigger than others. Everyone gets a piece of the pie, except those who get nothing. And we don't mention those who get nothing in case they take a piece of our pie. Sure, some people get more than others, but some people have more luck than others. Some people get more pie than others, and some people get crumbs. It's a good thing it's only pie, isn't it? It's a good thing it's not our lives, isn't it? It's a good thing it's not our world, isn't it? It's a good thing it's only pie. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to unpin my video. And oh, wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing your poetry and being so generous with your writing and with your performances. I really enjoyed hearing them all, and hearing them all next to one another as well. I think there's something really powerful about hearing a lot of poetry in succession that I really appreciate. So thank you all for that. Right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to seamlessly move us on to the next part of our program. So, as I mentioned at the start, we are now going to have a bit of a chat amongst our 4 poets about the nature of being a poet and poetry and inspiration and that kind of jazz. If at any point anyone in the audience has a question that they would like to ask either to all the poets or to one specific poet, please do drop those in the chat, and I will keep an eye on the chat, and hopefully we'll answer some of those questions towards the end. However, let's start with the obvious question, but a question that needs to be asked. How did you each get started writing poetry? And I'm going to ask that question first to Ray, if I can, please. How did you first start writing poetry, Ray?
I came through poetry through Bob Dylan, actually, through music. When I was a teenager, so I was into music and into Bob, and I discovered that Bob named himself after Dylan Thomas, and so I looked up Dylan Thomas, and then I read him and fell in love with him, as a lot of young poets do, and was terribly influenced by him in my early years. Like Eliot's idea of tradition, it was like, oh, okay, so I read a bit of Dylan Thomas, and Dylan Thomas was influenced by someone else, and someone else was influenced by, and it just, it just grew from there, Leanne. So I still listen to music, so from Bob Dylan, I got into poets and got into poetry, and just started writing the stuff from my early 20s, didn't write decent stuff until my 30s. So it took me 10 years to ply my trade, and hopefully was writing good stuff in my 30s, and hopefully since then. So that's the way I discovered poetry.
That's really cool. Thank you, Ray. And I think that that's something that really probably resonates with many of our audience and some of our other poets, I'm sure. Sue, how about you? How did you get involved in writing poetry?
Well, I can't remember not writing ditties and poems as a child, but I think my main influence was the 1960s beat poets. So Roger McGough, the Liverpool poets, Adrian Henry, they were the sort of big influence from the point of view of making performance poetry something cool. It was sort of seeing little bits of late night televised poetry performances on obscure BBC Two programmes that made me think, hey, this is pretty good. This is rock and roll. So that was sort of why I wanted to write more. But I have always written silly little rhymes and poems and that sort of thing, but never thought it was good enough to perform until, oh goodness, I was in my 50s before I started, certainly late 40s, before I started thinking I could perform anything and anyone would want to listen.
Thank you, Sue. That's really interesting. And sometimes with age comes, wisdom and a sort of not giving a stuff about the performance side of things and just going and doing it. And I'm really grateful that you started performing, because you're one of my favourite poets.
Bless you. Thanks, Leanne.
How about you, Brendan? How did you come to poetry?
I came to writing poems in a roundabout way, Leanne. I sort of left school and lived in the country for a while, and then moved into the city in Melbourne, and was part of that process of living in Melbourne, where I wasn't quite happy with it and was finding it hard to engage with a lot of things. And I was also hanging around with a lot of sort of writers and artists in the suburbs in Kilda. And I was reading, but I was sort of undirected. And then when I went back to uni, I started reading about Australian poets. And these were Australian poets who were writing sort of from the 1960s onwards, and were part of not so much the Roger McGough movement, but more of the movement against the formal poetry that was happening, you know, all around the world before then. And so these Australian poets, Michael Dransfield was one, Robert Adamson's another one, and all these other poets that they were being published in the 60s and 70s. I started reading them, and it seemed much more accessible to what I could write. And then it just was a process of writing, like Ray, writing in the netherworld for about 10 years before you actually found the courage to show anyone or to think that your writing was actually getting better. And, you know, then it's been an ongoing process. But yeah, like Ray, I read Dylan Thomas, I read the Beats. I mean, the main thing that got me writing was reading poets from not only Australia, around the world. And as it still is the case now. So, and I still have a soft spot for Dylan Thomas, of course, but, you know, I wouldn't read him as much now. But I think you need someone to kickstart, no matter what your style or writing is. You need another poet who sort of speaks to you to sort of help you go forward. So, yeah, that's been about 30 or 40 years ago now.
Wow, thank you, Brendan. And I think that that's, again, something that probably resonates with a lot of the writers in the audience as well, that idea of writing sort of almost secretly for the first few years of your sort of writing career before getting the confidence to show anyone. So yeah, that certainly resonated with me. Thank you, Brendan. Manjit, how about you?
I started writing poetry in 2016 on a Wednesday, actually my first poem was performed on a bus with a group of activists going to an anti-fascist, anti-racist march in London, and everybody, and then the person at the front of the bus got to London and went, and I said, are you going to do a speech, get us going, because we're going to take on the fascists, we may as well have a bit of a sing-song. And she goes, well, the toilets are easy to find and we're coming back at 4. I said, that's not a really good speech, is it? She goes, well, I don't think people need it. I said, can I do a poem? And she goes, oh, no, I don't think we're ready for poetry. And that was it. I thought, well, we can tear the head off the Nazis and smash fascism and take on capitalism, but poetry is going too far. And that's when I thought, poetry is more scary than political activism. And I thought, this is it. I'm going to do it. So I did a poem, Empire Calling, which was about being Indian, and I really relate to Brendan's cow poetry, and I'm really going to nick that for my own. But I thought, I'm going to do a poem, and I did a poem. And there were people a bit worried about how it was going to go for me as a poet, you know, and because people are scared of art, because they don't know whether it'll work or not. And I know the activists went, that's not too bad, actually. I didn't even realise poetry was that good. So that's how it started. And I think I've been trying to convince my political activists the value of poetry and convince poets the value of activism. So I swing between the two pendulums, but I think poetry is just a brilliant vehicle. So that's what really got me. And I remember, my first stand-up poet was watching Linton Kwesi Johnson on the Old Grey Whistle Test in the early 80s, and I was only a young lad. And Linton Kwesi Johnson did a couple of poems, and he was just a rock star, and it was fantastic, and just summed up the experience of immigration and being black and British and not being belonging to a home. That was great. And since then, I realised that, I was standing at, just studying poetry, listen to the three poets today, yourself, Leanne. I'm just learning all the time and stealing, sampling all people's work, which is just brilliant because that's the inspiration. But it's really important, activism. And recently I've been looking back at the Claude McKay and the Harlem Renaissance poetry of the Black movement in the 1920s, and then looking back at Lawrence Ferlinghetti and the beat poets in New York against America in the 50s and the Vietnam War, and to Linton Kwesi Johnson. And I realized there's a massive history of activist resistance poetry. So yeah, so that was how it started.
Fantastic. And you're so right, there's such a rich vein of poetry as activism and poetry in activism, I think, and it's something that it always I'm really grateful for is the vast breadth and depth of genre within poetry. When you talk to a non-poet about poetry, they think it's all sort of the sonnets of Shakespeare and I wandered lonely as a cloud, but there's such a beautiful breadth of things that people are talking about, things that people are interested in, and I think we've sort of shown that today with this. So thank you for that, Manjit. I'm going to move on to our second question, and I'm going to do a reverse order. So Manjit, I'm coming back to you first. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you all, because we're talking about being in two different places on this Zoom call, I wanted to ask, how does where you live influence what you write, Manjit?
How do I, well, that's a really good question. I think everything influences my poetry. I think it never stops. And once you start listening to a poem, it's a bit like going to an art exhibition. You go to the art exhibition, then you come out of the exhibition and look at everything as art. The bin becomes art, the bench becomes art, the trees become installations. And that's what poetry does. Once you listen to poetry, you then come out and look at everything as a poem. And I think inspiration is everywhere. I think the way the life itself, I mean, I clearly, I've been an activist a long time, but poetry is really a good way of processing pain and help you get, even though you're in struggle, you can find hope and liberation. You can be liberated through writing poetry. So that's really, where poetry, it's everywhere for me.
Fantastic, thanks, Manjit. Brendan, I think it's quite obvious from your poetry that you're influenced by place, but it'd be really nice to hear how that works for you, if you'd like to talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. Well, it is interesting. I mean, I don't live down in the area where I often write about. I don't always write about the Western District, but I often do. And I like to have my distance from it, if you can understand that, because I think for me, if I lived down there, I'd be too close to it and I wouldn't be able to get the emotional distance or the psychological distance to write about it. But on the other hand, when I was much younger, I didn't want to write about growing up in the country because it was very, unfashionable. And it was only really when I had this poet who was a mentor and teacher, John Forbes, an Australian poet, and he was I'd take my poems to him and he'd give me feedback and tell me what was crap and what was working and so on. And the poems that tended to work more were the poems that were based in the country or were set in the country. And I think this is the process that when I was writing, I could select images and ideas that were sort of much clearer than when I was writing about the country. And it was, the distance I had from those experiences that might have made it easier too. But at the same time, I don't just sort of write about the beautiful landscape either. I'm quite critical at times, certainly of farming practices, certainly of the landscape in some ways, and other times I evoke it. So it's a kind of, it's a place that's really important to me. And yeah, the funny thing was when I was over in England, I was saying before, I was living in England in the 90s, I found it very hard to write about the Western District, maybe because I was surrounded by everything in England and London. But when I came back, that's when the writing really kick-started. So yeah, place is important to me, and and the Western District is important as a sense of belonging for me. But perhaps if I moved to the south coast of New South Wales, I'd find a similar connection as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Brendan. And I, again, relate really strongly to that idea of having a bit of emotional distance from the place in order to write about it. That's really sort of clicked something in my brain. So thank you for sharing that one. Sue, how about you? Do you write about where you live?
Not really where I live, no. I have written a few scathing statements about where I live. I'm more interested in the sense of belonging rather than the sense of place. So I tend to write more about that. So I feel more centred towards the city than I do, the city of Nottingham, than I do the actual town that I live in. I sort of feel that I need connections and be with people who I feel are my tribe, rather than an actual place, a geographical place. So I don't think I'm that great at writing about place, although people tell me that quite often it's in there, it's just not said as a specific thing. So I struggle a little bit with the concept of, oh, write about place. But having said that, we've just done a piece about Nottingham in our blood, as Claire knows. And even that I wrote about the poets rather than the place.
That's really interesting. So for you, the place is the people in the place.
Yes.
And that's what inspires you. That's really interesting. Thank you, Sue. And Ray, how about you? What's your connection to place in your work?
No, that's sort of rather bland, actually. I did one of my books, the Barrier Range, was about trying to find a sort of long lost uncle who lived in a remote part of Australia. So when I was writing that book and researching it, I discovered that part of Australia that I hadn't been to before. So that certainly informed that book in a big way. But since then, it has, it hasn't made me want to go and live there at all. But so I sort of defer to Brendan on this, because sense of place is very profound in Brendan's writing, and I can understand where he needed to at times move away from that to write about it. But it's part of his soul, and he says, I could move to a part of New South Wales and might be the same. But no, it won't, Brendan. That part of the world is you, and you're part of that world, and it informs your writing in a brilliant way and makes you the good poet that you are. So I have nothing, Leanne. Basically, I lived in suburban Melbourne most of my life. It's only been the last 4 years that I've moved to a part of Victoria, which is on the southwest coast. So I live in a place that right on the river, the Hopkins River here. So I would love to write as many poems about the river as Robert Adamson has written about the Hawkesbury River. And I think he owns that river, basically. But since I've moved here, I have written a number of poems about the river, but it's more so about relationships and feelings. But the river is sort of, it's there, So yeah, that's basically it with me, Leanne.
That's really interesting. So you're sort of similar to Sue in that idea of sort of the relationships and the connections are more.
Yes.
And I wonder if that's something to do with the fact that both you and Sue are sort of poets who have lived in more urban areas. And I wonder if there's a sort of disconnect from the sort of natural world, that because Brendan has lived in the countryside, he has a more strongly sort of focus to place in his work.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Brendan, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I would, because when I was younger, I had this bee in my bonnet that people, if you write about the country, you should write about it from a rural perspective of someone who's lived there. And I'm not so sort of hung up on that, but it's certainly telling when someone has grown up in the country, whether they're Indigenous in Australia or not, your sensibility and connection to nature, land, or even alienation from it and isolation is so much different from someone who's from an urban area and looking at the country. Then that's not to say that the two viewpoints can't exist. Of course they do, but I always look for other writers who seem to have some connection that's inherent in their writing to place and to the country that they are. And of course, I've been drawn to other writers around the world like that as well, who have this close connection to nature or to landscape in its many forms of writing. And, you know, as because of the climate change conference and the world we're living in, writing about nature now is quite different to what it might have been, you know, in the past. So, yeah, it's an ongoing thing, but yeah, it's the voice of the person who's writing, whether they're male, female, or whatever, from the country is often quite telling.
That's really interesting. And I think that, yes, you're right. I think there's room for all perspectives, certainly. But I think that what is particularly wonderful about writing about the country or the city from a personal perspective is that those are the poems that only you as a writer can write. And that for me is the most exciting type of poetry to come across, is a poem that I think, this could only be written by this writer. And some of that is about place, and some of it is about the connections, like Ray and Sue were mentioning as well. So,
can I just say one final thing? And the other thing is, it's the difference between, or the transition between, the country and the city that, you know, I've been sort of writing about for a long time too, which it's the same for many other writers. You know, if you grow up in the country, many people move away to the city for work or whatever. So there's always going to be these connections and disconnections, and I find that really interesting, that area.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, I'm from a rural part of the UK and moved away to the big city, so I can really relate to that, what you just said there as well. Thank you, Brendan. Great conversation. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to move on to our next question, if I can, please. And this one is about asking you about the poetry community and the writers community where you live. So, Sue, do you want to tell us a little bit about the writing community in Nottingham?
It's bloody brilliant. We're very fortunate in Nottingham because there's a really strong and varied community of writers, particularly poets, in Nottingham. Pre-COVID, you couldn't move for a workshop or a reading. Now, obviously, it's a little bit less, but we are still hanging on in there, and we're getting together as much as we can. There are lots and lots of writers groups around. Leanne is a treasure because she gets us involved in lots of things and tells us about stuff that's happening, and runs Paper Cranes and is an inspiration. And I could keep going about Leanne all day if you let me loose. So I would say we are extremely lucky to have this in Nottingham. And although I'm 17 miles out and they wouldn't know a poem if they tripped over it out here, at least I can get on a bus or a tram and I can be in Nottingham in an hour and be part of that. So yeah, it's a very vibrant and eclectic scene in Nottingham. It's wonderful.
Fantastic, thank you, Sue. And Manjit, how does that intersect with the sort of the work that you do with poetry and activism in the East Midlands?
Yeah, well, I think there are lots of, again, Sue, you know, it's like being at university and Leanne is the professor of poetry and we've got to be on our best behaviour because, and before getting too sycophantic, one of my biggest influences has been Leanne. The one thing that you did with Crossword was when I first got up and did a poem in front of 30 poets, they took me seriously and that was really good. And to take everybody's poem, whether it's your first poem ever, or it's your third book, that's the nature of poetry. The supportive audience of poets makes you go back and get you addicted. And that sort of humanity and love is very rare to find in other sort of genres. And the lack of snobbery was critical to allow me to carry on. And that's really been important. But Nottingham has got it's a city of rebels. You know, we're still robbing people in Kirkby and Ashfield and Mansfield on a regular basis. But it's great to be part of a city of resistance and rebels and people who think differently. So that's really, and Nottingham's full of that, and it's great. It really helps. But also, it's great to have people who are thinkers, people who think differently, and artists, because you can't build a city with just city buildings and planners. You need artists to build cities to make it feel home, and so that's really critical. Nottingham's really vibrant with that. It's got a really good tradition, and the other thing is, people take risks in Nottingham with art and music and poetry. And if you don't take risks, you don't actually progress, because it should be frightening for people. People should be scared of poetry because it's an incredible tool. And that's so Nottingham's got a good tradition of that. So I want to, sometimes you get the feeling, let's get back to cities being full of poets rather than politicians.
Fantastic. Thanks, Manjit. And obviously we share with Melbourne. We're both Nottingham. We're both UNESCO cities of literature. So that in itself as well is a really nice way to sort of celebrate and elevate literature and specifically poetry in our respective places. Ray, how about you? What sort of poetry community are you part of, if at all?
Yeah, well, in Warrnambool, it's fairly quiet. When I first moved here, there was a regular monthly meeting, and even when I was in Melbourne, I used to come up and go to that reading. But yeah, look, COVID's had a huge impact, of course, everywhere. So there was that monthly reading, and then a few other sort of more open mic events, but it wasn't big outside of that regular monthly reading, and then that fell over a couple of years ago. Since then, there's really hasn't been much here. And to give you a perspective, Warrnambool is like 320 kilometres, which is, I don't know, 200 plus miles from Melbourne. So it's a long way. So Melbourne poetry scene itself I think even you guys would have heard about the Melbourne poetry scene. I reckon it's the most vibrant in the world. And seriously, there would be not just one reading on every night of the week. There would be 2 or 3 to go to if you wanted to every single night of the week. Pre-COVID, obviously since then, not as quite much activity, but given where I live at the moment, and Brendan is in this part of the world, would probably agree that, there's not a great deal here, Leanne, at the moment. Look, having said that, the person who put my name up for this event at the local library, her and I had been talking about getting a poetry reading up and running again, so maybe on a quarterly basis. But with COVID restrictions, we may make that monthly or whatever. And then also, Warrnambool was part of a poetry slam, the Australian Poetry Slam, Manjit. Local poets were invited to read and become part of that, which is a very well-known poetry slam event in Australia. So some local poets represented Victoria for that poetry slam So yeah, it came to Warrnambool in a weird sort of way. Yeah, but not much, Leanne, at the moment.
Sure, and I think it's probably the case that it's sort of proportionable to the size of the city or the town. So
Yes, exactly.
As I say, I used to live in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't have any sort of poetry events, so we sort of made our own. So there's something really nice in the opportunity, like you say, of making stuff your own and getting people together and bringing those communities to your own sort of locality. So I'm really excited to hear about like a poetry reading series in a library. That sounds like right up my street. So next time I'm in Warrnambool, I'll come. How about you, Brendan?
Yeah, things are, as Ray said, we've been all impacted by COVID here, and things are pretty quiet in Geelong where I live. Occasionally there's been readings, and our local library services had readings going, but they're been a bit sporadic. I should say, I want to talk about one of the casualties kind of COVID, but also of other things too. In Melbourne, we used to have this poetry bookshop called Collected Works, which was run by Chris Hemmensley, who's a poet from England, and he moved to Australia in the late 1960s. And the Collected Works was a poetry bookshop just devoted mainly to poetry. And there's poetry from all around the world. And Chris is an amazing kind of guy who connects many poets together from all different walks of life, and many visiting poets to Australia would call in and find the hard to get books at his bookshop. But it was also a centre for poetry readings and poetry launches, and they'd be on regularly throughout the week, mainly throughout the week or a Friday night, and draw people, poets from across Melbourne from slightly different groups, but they'd all come together. And that's been, that kind of community of poets was really strong. And unfortunately, Chris has sort of had to move out of the premises, mainly due to economic factors and that. And he still has a presence in Australian poetry. And so the main thing that how I connect with other poets is through the internet, through friends on email and Instagram and stuff like that. And so Chris still has a slight bookshop where he lives in Melbourne, but his bookshop, Collected Works, was one of a kind. There was no other poetry bookshop like it in Australia. I don't think there was no bookshop just devoted to poetry.
No, I'm glad you mentioned him, Brendan. Yeah, I don't know whether people have heard about Collected Works, but Chris coming from England, it was an institution, Leanne, for decades. And the man is still around. Sadly, he lost his wife earlier this year, very recently. But he set up a little bookshop in a loft at the back of his house in a suburban part of Melbourne. So the man is still around, and the legend continues in its way. So yeah, thank you, Brendan, for mentioning Chris. Yeah, he's a dear sweet man.
Fantastic. And that sounds like such, and that's what it's about, isn't it, with communities, particularly with writers, is having those people who are doers and who are like the linchpins of getting people together. And it sounds like Chris was one of those for Melbourne. So that's really wonderful to hear about.
Definitely.
And I do hope that there will be Collected Works too at some point in the future. That would be really nice. Fantastic. Thank you all for that. We are getting to the point in the evening/morning where we would like to elicit questions from the audience. There's a little bit of interesting chat going on in the chat box about poetry in urban planning, and a little bit of talk about the poems that are up on the walls, particularly in a town that's just north of here in Sheffield. There are a few poems up on the walls of buildings. Following on from that, I'd like to ask a slightly sort of fun and frivolous question. If you were to have one of your poems up on a public building somewhere, which one would you choose and why? And I'm going to start with Sue. I'm going to put you on the spot, Sue.
Gee, thanks. Poem or building or both?
Both, please.
Oh God, I don't know. It would be nice to have something on the town hall in Nottingham, wouldn't it? Although you've already done that, haven't you, Leanne Moden? You've had projections. You've had projections in Nottingham.
Yes, but this is. I'm thinking of like a
permanent.
Yeah. So just for a bit of context for those of you who aren't Nottingham based, our council house building is like a very fancy building built in 1910, and it stands in the main square of the city, and would be a great place to put a poem, certainly.
Yeah. And I think I'd go for Nottingham Nights, for the one I wrote for Lolly, because it's all about charging across Nottingham to get to various poetry gigs and, you know, chasing the lions. We've got 2 lions outside that building, and there's an art newspaper that's called The Left Lion. And everybody meets by the left lions, and the poor old right lion is always left out of the picture. I don't know why that would be, but it is. And so, you know, I think I would quite like something between those lions.
That's a fantastic suggestion. I'm just going to put a link to what the council house building looks like in the chat in case anybody wants to give it a cheeky look. Brendan, how about you? Where would you put a poem if you could?
It sounds a bit like an epitaph or something. I don't know. Maybe a poem from my first book called Why I'm Not a Farmer. And that could go on the side of the Performing Arts Centre in Warrnambool. So that everyone down there could read it and they could relate to being farmers or not being farmers.
That sounds perfect. Really good.
Thank you. Go on the wall of an abattoir.
Oh.
Yeah, well, the abattoir down there, Sue, is the biggest employer of people in Warrnambool. So on the side of Midfield Meats would be good.
Wow. Yeah, that would be nice to have that juxtaposition of sort of something quite necessary but slightly brutal, and then something beautiful and also necessary. That'd be really nice. Thank you, Brendan. Manjit, how about you? Where would you put a poem if you could?
Oh, actually, you've just given me an idea and I'm going to get arrested for it. Thank you. I'm going to project one of my poems on the House of Commons in London and then perform the poem in front of the House of Commons and wait for the police to drag me off. So I would think of putting my poem, England's Going Backwards, projected on the House of Commons and wait for Boris Johnson to come out and wrestle me to the floor, because he does that to children on a regular basis. So that's a brilliant idea. Start projecting poems on buildings, get arrested, get on TV and spread poetry globally as the biggest resistance to capitalism ever. That's brilliant. Well done. So yeah, that'll be great.
Okay, we're not responsible for any
don't try this at home.
Thank you, Manjit. How about you, Ray? What are your thoughts on this one?
Oh yeah, sort of never thought about it. But having said that, yeah, I have sort of entered a couple of not competitions, but where you can have your work displayed on public buildings and whatever. So Melbourne did do that for a little while in different venues. We have a square called the Federation Square, where they used to put up ticker tape, poems rotating around. But look, outside of that, having moved to Warrnambool now, look, I'm thinking in the way my mind works is that there is a statue here which is called the Dirty Angel. So it's a figure that if you view it from a certain angle, it has a sword in a sheath, and from front on, that's fine. But if you move around onto the side, the sword in the sheath may resemble some part of the anatomy. And I'm thinking if I can maybe get one of my dirty ditties and just hanging off the end of that sword, and people can go around that roundabout and just keep going around the roundabout and reading the poem.
I should say, Leanne, I grew up hanging laps around that roundabout.
Wonderful, wonderful stuff. I'm just looking at pictures of it, and you are right. It does look a bit grubby from certain angles.
You found it? What? God,
I'm
you're
an
quick.
Googler, yeah. Fantastic. That's a great suggestion. Thank you, Ray. Cool. We've got about 8 minutes or so, so we've got time for a question from the audience if anybody would like to pop one in the chat super quickly. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to my list of pre-prepared questions. I'm going to give you a few seconds to do your typing. Doesn't look like anybody's biting. So, with that in mind, I'm going to ask you. So this is quite a boring question, but I'm hoping that it will elicit some interesting answers. This is something that happens maybe once every 5 years. That people ask, oh, poetry seems to be very popular these days. And what's the reason for it? Why do you think that poetry is popular now? And I'm going to start with Brendan on that one, please.
I think, to me, poetry goes in waves, and it's been popular at different times. And the popularity now is due to different factors, maybe from when it was popular in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and so on. Certainly the internet and writing and exhibiting your writing on the internet and social media has contributed to its popularity. But, you know, as Manjit's bringing up lots of issues and causes and social justice reasons, I think giving a voice to people when many people have had their voices taken away from them for various reasons or by governments, I think that's a very powerful reason for people to write and to try and express themselves. Perhaps more so than other years in the past. The ironic thing is it's popular, and it's there's poetry slams and there's a great community that you seem to have over there, but it's incredibly hard to get a book of poems published. And there's various reasons for that, of course, but, you know, on the whole, major publishers don't publish poetry, well, certainly in our country, and I don't think much in England either. It's small presses that publish it. And those small presses, you know, run on an orly rag, and so there's not a lot of money to be made out of poetry, which is, you know, the kind of ironic thing. And yet still we're drawn to this ancient form of expression writing, and in some ways telling truths that aren't being told. So I think there's a number of reasons, and I probably haven't sort of narrowed it down to one, but as a writer who's been writing for, you know, quite a few years, I'm always rapt when it comes into popularity. And I'm a teacher too. I teach poetry to secondary students, and there's another avenue there to try and engage students with it. And, you know, students come to poetry and writing in a similar way to what they might have done in the years past. They don't know that much about it, and so it's great to sort of engage them. And there's so many different poets and different styles of writing that you can engage young people with nowadays. So whether it's slam poetry, whether it's formal poetry, whether it's poetry for the page, whether it's this and that, we are so rich in our writing. And maybe those are reasons that why it's so popular too. But I'm still sort of, I still think it gives a voice to us that many of us don't have formally or aren't always given.
Lovely, thank you, Brendan. We've just had a question in the chat that I think I'd like to ask Manjit just before we finish off, which is from, where have I, oh, I've lost it now. It's from Kirsty. Kirsty says,
yeah.
I'm involved in Extinction Rebellion in Warrnambool, which is obviously challenging. How can XR use poetry? Manjit, how can Extinction Rebellion use poetry?
Brilliant. Yeah, Extinction Rebellion have got their own poetry group in England. So go to Extinction Rebellion, click on Extinction Rebellion Poets. They have their own poetry section. So they encourage poets to perform poetry in rallies, when you're glued to the floor, you know, people got time, you got a fixed audience, so you can read your poem. So yeah, Extinction Rebellion, and I've performed and linked with Extinction Rebellion, but they've got their own poetry group, as have a lot of activist groups have got their own spoken word artists as part of their organization. Stop the War campaign have got their own spoken word groups. So yeah, XR have definitely got their own poetry group. So just, and if they haven't got one, start one.
Yes, get stuck in, I think, is the message. And when you're writing poetry as a form of activism, I think
get stuck in is a brilliant poem, Leanne. That's great.
I'm going to write that down.
Get stuck in.
So, you
Excellent.
know, it's puns all over the shop here. Thank you all. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so what I'm going to do, unfortunately, I feel like we could talk for another hour or two, but we are going to have to bring it to a close now. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank all four of our poets, to Sue and Brendan and Ray and Manjit, for all their wonderful discussion and for sharing their poetry with us. Just before we go, I wanted to let some of you know that if you are in Warrnambool and you would like to contribute to a shared collaborative poem that I'm writing about the F project, you can do that by clicking on the link that I've just dropped into the chat. It's a little form about how you feel about the F project, what it means to you, and some strange questions about if it were a colour, what colour would it be, and all that kind of silly poetry stuff. But I would really appreciate it if you would like to share your thoughts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring all those thoughts together and hopefully make a poem celebrating the F project out of that. So yeah, do click on that link if you would like to contribute to that. Thank you again to the F project for having us this evening. It's been a really wonderful evening / morning. I've really enjoyed it, and I've particularly enjoyed hearing new poets and hearing poets that I've already know that I love perform again. So thank you all, and yes, that's us for today. So take care, have a lovely rest of your Friday and a lovely weekend.